welcome to another installment of Genius Academy. We're talking about historical analogies. This is the third lecture in the series, and today we're going to be talking about the comparison between Renaissance of the Paleologu dynasty on one end and Romanticism on the other. So we need to be a bit more precise about this for the people who are not familiar with Renaissance of the Paleologu dynasty or the Paleologu Renaissance. We're talking about the Byzantine period. We're talking about the Byzantine Empire, in particular the 13th century in Byzantine Empire and onwards. So some context, some historical context when it comes to this, what made us compare these two periods, not just that we're talking about something that came after the eras of Romanesque and Neoclassicism, but we're also talking about these two periods that are very interesting and comparable because they're happening alongside another already existing period. Now, when it comes to the context that is more close to us chronologically, when it comes to Neoclassicism and Romanticism, we can argue that in visual arts they're happening at the same time. And this is nowhere more true than in the Louvre Museum, where we give a lot of tours, where we find ourselves very often. When you go and visit that part of the Denon Gallery of the Louvre, you can see that one very large room is dedicated to Romanticism, and the other very large room right next to it is dedicated to Neoclassicism. The branch of Neoclassicism in France is also called Decadentism, so there's that. Interesting thing about these two periods is that they happen at the same time, at the same place, and they're very different one from another, but they happen alongside one another. And this is entirely comparable to the situation in which the Byzantine Empire is back in the 13th, 14th century. Well, really all throughout its existence, you might argue. What we're talking about in particular is the fact that Rome is divided into Western and Eastern section. We all know this. After a certain period of this division of Rome coexisting, Western Roman Empire falls apart. This is 476, though again there are many debates about this. It doesn't really matter. Eastern Roman Empire continues existing all up until the fall of Constantinople, which happens in 1453. So when we are talking about European history, and especially if we're talking about European medieval history, we tend to focus on Western European history, and we tend to focus on the history of the Western European continent, the one that was left over after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And very often we tend to forget, strangely, that existed also the Eastern Roman Empire that was arguably as important, if not more important, than the Western Roman Empire. If for nothing else, but for the fact that it continued existing another 1,000 years after the West has fallen. Almost 1,000 years. So it is a very interesting thing that we have entire development of Byzantine culture, of Byzantine art, Byzantine history, politics, and everything else, civilization, we could say, whereas what's happening in the West is fairly different. Now, of course, these two entities are in touch, they're in contact, they're often disputing many different things. We know that in the 11th century there was a great schism, the great division of Christianity into two sections, Orthodoxy on one end, Catholicism on the other. But the thing I'm trying to address here is that there is a comparable situation between the Byzantine Empire on one end and the remnants of the Western Roman Empire on the other. So the dynamics between Eastern Roman Empire and former Western Roman Empire on one end, and then we have the similar dynamics between Romanticism and Neoclassicism. Again, these are things that happen at the same time, oftentimes at the same place. Let's say France is one of those countries where these two styles, these two stylistical formations, and indeed eras coexist. Both of them also, which is interesting to mention, are very much inspired, very much focused on the French Revolution. So this is the key political event, a momentous historical event that has inspired two very different styles that happened at the same time and at the same place. Now, why did we decide to talk about Romanticism on one end and the Renaissance of the Paleologs on the other? Well, we can say that two rather similar set of historical circumstances have inspired us to do so. So we can say that what happens with the Byzantine Empire, or rather the Eastern Roman Empire. This is how they call themselves. They have never called themselves the Byzantines. This is something that only came from the West. Is that they were invaded in the beginning of the 13th century by the crusading armies of the West. And not only that they were invaded, they were conquered, sacked, and almost all but destroyed. So Constantinople had fallen, and the people of Constantinople, people of the entire Eastern Roman Empire, had a very hard time with this newfound situation, but especially the city of Constantinople. It was a very large city, prosperous, developed, flourishing culture. In many, many ways, it was superior to the remnants of the Western Roman Empire. So what happened was not only massacred, we could also label it as a genocide, not only pillaging and destruction of the city, taking of many precious, valuable works of art, desecrating many churches, conversion of many churches from Orthodox to Catholic, and many other atrocities that you can imagine happening during war, especially during medieval warfare. So you could say that this was something that deeply scarred Byzantine culture, an event that this culture never truly recovered from. Now, the Renaissance of Paleologs is what happens after Byzantine Empire is restored and is reclaimed by the Emperor Mikhail VIII of Paleolog. So he is someone who is able to restore the Byzantine Empire. He is someone who ushers in reconstruction of not only their empire, but also of their culture. Because in this particular period, and arguably in any other period, culture really is one of the symbols of the state. Culture is a very powerful statement. It's a very powerful aspect of identity, and it's a very powerful show of power, not to say of flex. But let's say the better your culture is, the better your state is, the more respect you can command as a statesperson and as an entire state. So the Renaissance of the Paleologs, of course, has its very important political aspects, it has its very important historical and, of course, cultural and artistic aspects. Now, how does this compare to Romanticism? Now, this is the part that is very interesting to me. If we're talking about the whole era of Romanticism, we are truly talking about it happening in the space that today we call Germany. It was called many different things back in the day, in different eras. For a very long period of time, the territory that roughly corresponds to today's Germany was called the Holy Roman Empire, which was labeled as Voltaire to be neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. This was just for us to underline that this part of the world too saw itself as Roman. So for almost 1,000 years, or actually just a bit over 1,000 years, they called themselves the Holy Roman Empire, and they were recognized by the Pope, by Vatican, to be such. So this particular part of the world was all but destroyed by Louis XIV. He wrecked Germany profoundly. Louis XIV, in his many military escapades and his conquests, had destroyed almost every German castle he came upon. And he really made an irreparable damage to German culture. So this was the reason for the German people to start deeply, profoundly, wholeheartedly hating not only Louis XIV, but entire France, everything that has to do with France, everything that has to do with French culture and French heritage. Not to go into the whole tangent about if this is still the case or not, let's leave that entirely aside. Let us just focus on what happens in this particular period that we're talking about. We're talking about the 18th century, and then after that we're talking about the 19th century. These are the times where Romanticism takes place. So we have this whole idea of entire unapologetic, direct refusal of everything that comes from the West. Now you can see how this already compares to what happened in the Byzantine Empire. That Byzantine Empire was scorned, hurt, disappointed, downright traumatized by what has happened to them. They came to understand that it was far worse for them to be invaded and conquered by their Christian brothers than to be invaded and conquered by the Muslims, because they were waging war with the Muslims for a while now, and they were in constant negotiations with the Western European powers over sending help to them, helping them to better wage war on the rising Muslim population. So the whole notion of being attacked by someone who is your brother in Christ, someone who is supposed to be your ally, and not only being attacked, but being downright destroyed, pillaged, irreparably hurt, was very much akin to what happened between Germany and France. and what happened between the German people and the French people. Now, what the Germans downright refused was not just the totality of French culture, it was one very specific aspect of French culture that came to be known as the Enlightenment era. And this is something that is incredibly influential, not only in terms of French culture or Franco-German relations, but also in terms of global influence, because the era of Enlightenment came up with many solutions that define the current world as it is to this day. So if we're talking about the French Revolution, truly it's a political event that comes as the pinnacle of the Enlightenment era and the entire Enlightenment initiative. So we could say that this notion of living in a nation state has a lot to do with the French Revolution, with the Enlightenment. This whole idea of secular culture has to do with the Enlightenment. Value of education, the initiative for us to educate ourselves, to install compulsory elementary education. Now, all these things go back to the Enlightenment, to the work of encyclopedists. This whole idea that we should start taking care of culture, that we should start making culture more available, more accessible, that we should start moving our society away from the church. Not to say that this is necessarily a good or a bad idea. We're just talking about values of that particular period. Now, all of these ideas, all of these impulses and initiatives were scorned in Germany, and Germans basically rebelled against all of this because they were hurt by what happened during the reign of Louis XIV, the glorious French king. They basically refused everything that came from France, and not only did they refuse it, they mounted their own response to it. So they created Romanticism. This first impulse of creation of Romanticism was basically a reaction to the Enlightenment. They sought to do everything exactly the opposite of the French. And so again, if we go back to the Byzantine example, the Byzantine analogy, we can say that the course in which Byzantine culture went was explicitly to remove itself from everything that came from the West, to further the gap between East and West. This entire entity that used to be one state, Eastern Roman Empire and Western Roman Empire, would no longer ever want to come in touch one with the other. East and West were definitively separated. There was no intent of bringing them back, and this is the situation that's going to be that way for many years to come. So we could say that if you're looking at Germany and France, the territory that, again, roughly corresponds to today's Germany, though it was not called that way back in the day, would be whatever was left when the Western Roman Empire fell apart. So you could say that the Western Roman Empire in the north of Europe, northwestern Europe, divided itself into what would be the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Western Roman Empire. So you could say that the Eastern Western Roman Empire was equivalent to today's Germany, more or less, and the Western Roman Empire was equivalent to today's France, again, more or less. So we have this dynamism between East and West when it comes to the former Western Roman Empire, much the same as we had dynamism between the East and West within the entirety of the Roman Empire when it comes to Byzantine and the former Western Roman Empire. So this in itself is comparable, this tense relationship between East and West. And if you want to further interpret this, you can go into deep and esoterical and symbolical and archetypal explanations into West with a capital W and East with a capital E. We don't need to do that right now. So we're going to go back on track with this. We have this whole idea of liberty becoming extremely important, and we can clearly understand why. Liberty and freedom. Now, not necessarily in terms in which we would talk about it in the philosophy of classical liberalism, not necessarily in terms in which we would talk about it in the Enlightenment, but more so as a reaction to that exact philosophical and political context. So we're talking about this idea that whoever is proclaiming liberty is actually attacking us, destroying us, and is taking our liberty, right? It's downright oppressing us. This is how the German people felt when they were destroyed by Louis XIV, and this is how the Byzantines felt when they were destroyed by the combined forces of Western Europe. So it's something that became very important, this idea that you're fighting for your person, you're fighting for your soil, for your culture, for your very existence. And of course, this has a very strong religious impetus to it. So we cannot separate religion from all of this, because we know that Byzantine Empire was Orthodox and the West, of course, was mostly Catholic. And then only later they would become also Protestant. So we have this whole idea that one of the key features of Romanticism really is all about freedom. It's about breaking apart. It's about releasing yourself from the chains, sometimes not just of your masters, chains from your oppressors, really chains of existence itself. You could argue that Romanticism was all about the spirit, was all about overcoming the body, and was all about attaining absolute freedom. If you go back on the other end to the Byzantine part of this analogy, you can say that their art is incredibly spiritual, that it was all about conquering matter, that it was all about turning yourself to the spirit. It was elevating yourself, becoming purely spiritual, or as much as it is possible, instead of being bound by the chains of material existence. So we're going to develop this in much greater detail in a minute. Now, you could also say that individualism is a very important feature that starts developing. Now, this is a very broad topic, and we're just going to be briefly able to encompass it and address it, because we can spend hours and hours talking about this. The fact is that we didn't have artists sign their works in Byzantine culture before the Renaissance of Palaeologs. So they just didn't. And this is the case in Western Europe as well. If we're looking at most of Western European medieval paintings, we don't see a lot of signatures. This was just not the practice. It was not seen as important. So you could say that if you're looking at medieval paintings that were done in Western Europe, you can often see signatures stating something like Meister of Nuremberg or Meister of Utrecht. Basically, this would mean that the painting was done by a studio of that city. So we would not see a name and the last name. So this is something that only started happening in late medieval, early Renaissance, and then fully Renaissance period in the West. This practice that artist is proud of their work, that they think that their name has a place in the painting, and that they want to make sure that the world knows that the painting was made by them. There is a very famous anecdote, and a very funny one, I think, where Michelangelo, when he made Pietà, he was only 24 years old. This is extremely young for such a momentous work of art that is a masterpiece of sculpture. No one wanted to believe that such a young man was able to do this amazing work of art. He was so angry with this widespread disbelief that he was driven to vandalize his own work of art. He went back to the Pietà and chiseled his name into it. So if you look at the stripe that goes over Madonna in that sculpture, you can see that it has its name. So very clearly written right in the middle of the statue, so that there is no confusion whoever has done it. I find this to be incredibly funny, that someone was driven to vandalize their own work, but let's leave that aside. Yes, individualism becomes a thing. And this entire cult of the artist becomes the thing. Now, this is the very important aspect of Romanticism when it comes to painting, but even more so when it comes to poetry, because more and more we start observing art as the matter of inspiration rather than the matter of technique. More and more we start thinking about an artist not as a skilled professional, which was pretty much the case, but rather as an inspired, unique, gifted, blessed individual, someone who was a for all spiritual, someone who had contact with higher spheres of existence, someone who had deeper insight. There becomes this entire cult of the poet, so poets become more important than they ever were. You could also argue very accurately, I would add, that this has to do with the Industrial Revolution that is happening at the same time. This has to do with machines being introduced in our society, people being more and more afraid of losing their humanity, of losing their individuality, and really of losing their organic presence and their organic bodily, corporeal importance, so they turn towards the spirit. Now, you could also say on the other end that what happens in the Byzantine Empire in these times, we're talking about the period from 13th century onwards, Byzantine Empire is in a decline, and this is something that cannot be disputed. So it shrinks. They don't have the political power that they used to have. They don't have the territories they used to have. They have dwindling armies. They have constant threats coming from the southeast. So they are in the period of constant decline. And their reaction to this decline is for their art to be more and more turned towards eternity, towards the spirit, towards heavenly, celestial affairs rather than earthly affairs. So this, you may argue, is a normal or expected reaction. So we can say how individualism that starts growing in the persona of the artist is very, very important aspect of this. Now, we need to briefly address something that I think is also comparable and is a little historical analogy in itself, something that has to do with the very birth of individualism, this whole idea that we are somehow important as units, and that our importance goes above or beyond our belonging to a certain group. So you could say that this really has to do with philosophy of Stoicism, and it goes back to the 3rd century BCE. It goes back to the period where, for the first time in its entire history, Greece became an empire, or rather, it became a part of a Hellenistic empire that was created by Alexander the Great. Now, Greece was never an empire before or since. They had an entirely different political structure. Greece was basically a lot of small or not that small poli, which meant a city-state. So you could say that Greek people never had this idea of ruling or being ruled by something that was something or someone that was far removed, that you would never really get to see in your life. You know, very few people get to see the emperor or the king, for that matter. And Greeks didn't have this idea that they would be ruled by a semi-divine or divine entity. Their rule, their idea of political life was immediate, because they partook in assemblies, they partook in gatherings, they had groups that ran their respective cities. So these groups were initially made of 300 people, then 400, then finally 500. And this is what we call democracy. Demos means the people, kratos is to rule, so it's the rule of the people themselves. So this means that if you were a Greek person back in the day, and if there were important political matters to discuss, you would go to your city's assembly, you would partake in a live active dialogue, you would defend your position using your oratory skills, your presence, your charms. The point is that you would be there, and your destiny was in your hands. If you were able or unable to push your agenda, it didn't really matter quite as much as the very fact that you were a part of the dialogue and people asked you. Now, of course, this only meant you were a part of the dialogue if you were a free citizen. If you were a slave, no one really cared about what you had to say. But Greek people did not really think about slaves at all, so they were only concerned in free people who had slaves and who had enough property to become parts of these assemblies we're talking about. So what happens when Greece becomes a part of the Hellenistic Empire is that they lose this immediate political influence they have. They are no longer in charge of their own destinies. They lose the reins over themselves in a way, and certainly over their polis. So they basically decide, as a reaction, to turn to themselves and to start developing their interior worlds. So you cannot really influence the world anymore. You've lost your political agency, you've lost your political subjectivity. You become an object, rather ruled by this very, very distant emperor who sees himself as a god and who went off to conquer Persia and possibly India, which, you know, sounds as insane nowadays as it did back in the day. So you lost all of political power that you had, and you basically turn inwards. So you could say that in this particular regard, the very origin of individualism is basically coping with defeat. It's a product of defeat. When we lost political power, we said, okay, I cannot rule the world around me, not necessarily rule as a tyrant, but influence, shape, act upon. I will therefore try to rule over myself. And this is the whole point. So you could argue that Stoics were reacting to this political defeat, to this loss of political sovereignty, in the similar way in which artists of the Paleologu Renaissance were acting on the loss of their political power and the decadence and the falling apart of their state. So you could argue that the German Romanticism era poets were reacting on what was happening to them in a very similar manner. They were exalting and they were elevating importance of spirit and all things spiritual because they felt frustrated over not having enough power over their immediate environment. So we could say that these are very comparable situations. Now, we need to address a very important aspect of Romanticism and also of the Renaissance of the Paleologs, and this is the particular type of eclecticism, mixture of genres, influences coming together. So this is the period where, due to said Western invasion of the Byzantine Empire, we have Eastern and Western artists coming into contact, and exchanging techniques and influencing one another. So these influences are visible in Byzantine paintings. Now, we need to say that the Byzantine people, Byzantine artists, stuck to their canon, and they made their icons in a canonically correct manner. So they would use certain colors, they would use certain gestures. This did not change. However, we saw influences from the West, and certainly in the West we saw influences from the East, because we need to say, and there is no controversy about this, Eastern painting, Eastern art, Byzantine art, was far, far superior than anything that was happening in the West. So you can compare yourself, you can see that there's really no competition. But the idea is that there is this mixture, there is this exchange of influence, so there is a certain eclecticism that happens. Now, a very similar situation happens in Romanticism, because Romanticism is driven by this agenda, by this need to liberate oneself, not only in terms of politics, nationalism, that is an ancient and very powerful ideology back in the day, but also in terms of artistic production. So we want to liberate ourselves from all the classical and neoclassical forms and rules and regulations and recommendations. We want our art not to be academic, we want it not to be strict, and we want it to be free. So you could say that it's truly in Romanticism that we start growing an interest for everything that is grotesque, everything that is odd, everything that is weird, strange, etc. This is the period when we start considering everyday topics to be perfectly legitimate and even desirable. So we start to develop this attitude that writing, let's say, about Greek gods or Greco-Roman affairs, or using Greco-Roman symbols or analogies or references, which was very important back in the day. So as you can show that you're a poeta doctus, you're an educated poet, you're an educated artist. This all became stuffy, and last season, in a way, it all became kind of boring. So the whole idea was that you wanted to write as a poet, or even as a painter, you wanted to paint something that has to do with your era, something that has to do with ordinary life. Now, as you can imagine, this was a major shift in perspective. This was a major revolution in the way, because people that stuck to their old sensibilities and to their old tastes did not accept this. So they saw no purpose in poetry unless it spoke of Greek gods. They saw no purpose in literature unless it was written in verse. So you could argue that, for example, and I think this is a very good example, a novel that in French is called roman, and you can see roman, romanticism, but nevertheless, was seen as an inferior genre. This was basically boulevard literature. So no worthy genre of literature was written in prose. Prose was seen as banal in itself. So novels were street literature, B or even C type literature. Nowadays, seeing how we live in the society that was deeply shaped, profoundly influenced by Romanticism, we tend to think that novels are synonymous with literature. We praise novelists as the most important literary artists. We praise them as the very synonym of the notion of writers. Back in the day, of course, this was not so. Back in the day, you were seen as a legitimate writer if you were a poet or if you were a playwright. And both of these poems and plays were written in verses. So to write a play in prose was absolutely abominable and scandalous. This is why Shakespeare, back in his time, was seen as scandalous when he proposed some parts of his plays given in prose. But back to the point, we have this whole idea in Romanticism not only of mixing of influences, mixing of genres, like tragicomedy, for example. We have this idea of liberation from standards, that this idea of appreciation of everything that is lowly, mixture of different techniques. We never had this before, not to this extent, except if we're talking about the Renaissance of the Paleologs, where we have this meeting of East and West. And the reason why I give this such a definitive value judgment to this is, again, this notion that, again, is not even disputable, that Eastern art was far superior to Western art. But even though it was superior, even though it was more developed technically, symbolically, in terms of skill, you name it, it still received a lot of influences from the West. And you could say that this is a very similar, comparable situation to what was happening in Romanticism, that people would decidedly go and write poems about everyday affairs. So the famous collection of poems written by Wordsworth and Coleridge that was called the Lyrical Ballades was written in England, was seen as very scandalous because it spoke of ordinary things. It spoke of kids playing, housewives doing their things, regular Sunday afternoons. So really something that was seen as offensively banal back in the time when it appeared. It was seen only to be worthy of poetry to write about sacred groves and Apollo running after a nymph, or Artemis trying not to be seen naked, or whichever other topics that came from this particular context. Because whatever had to do with myth was seen as eternally beautiful, eternally valuable, eternally important, and whatever had to do with everyday life was seen as lowly, banal, and even offensive. So this is exactly what Romanticist artists were trying to do. This is what they were interested in. So mixture of genres is a very important affair. Now, I want to go back to the very roots of Romanticism, and I want to compare it to what's happening in the Renaissance with Paleologs, talking about philosophical foundations of this particular movement. Now, we need to go to one of the most famous stories of frenemies in history of philosophy. This is a very interesting affair. We have two friends, we could say best friends and worst enemies all at the same time. We have Kant and Hamann, two people that regularly met for conversations, two people that could not be more different one from another. So Kant was seen as the pinnacle of the Enlightenment, a very important philosopher, a very important aesthetician. We may dedicate an entire course to him. He's more than worthy of elaboration. Kant was entirely invested in reason. He was entirely invested in the human mind, in the faculties of human mind. He was invested in understanding nature, understanding the world, understanding arts, of course, as the affair of the mind and as the affair of the imagination. He did not care terribly about emotions or about anything that was irrational. Now, you could imagine that on the other end, we had a person that was completely different, 180 degrees different, on a completely different end of the spectrum. So Hamann thought that it was exactly the opposite. He thought that people were driven by dark, deep impulses that were profoundly irrational. He thought that people were driven by emotions, and not just any emotions, but the darkest, most twisted, most appalling impulses. He thought people were essentially beasts. And you can just imagine how offensive this was to Kant. And you can then, on the other end, imagine how offensive Kant's position was to Hamann. So you could argue that Hamann was properly German and much more German than Kant was. His whole idea was that we as human beings have a very thin veneer of reason, and that what actually drives us is a ball of dark, condensed, dangerous and unexplored, impossible to explore in a way, a ball of twisted fears and traumas and impulses and dark drives that are very, very Chthonian in nature, right? Kant was very solar in his worldview. Hamann was very Chthonian. In case you were not following any of our previous courses or that we didn't get to address it, Chthonian is everything that has to do with the soil, with the underground. Solar is anything that has to do with the sun, with heavens. So it's much like spirit and body dichotomy. In this particular regard, we are talking about Hamann being a main driving impulse out of which Romanticism will evolve. So you can say that Kant is the pinnacle of enlightenment. No one will argue with this. You could say that Hamann is the very beginning of Romanticism, the very heart and source of Romanticism. And you can clearly see how this particular philosophy, how this worldview influences the very important thought processes in Romanticism. You can see, for example, how deeply influential Hamann is to Nietzsche, how Nietzsche develops a lot of his philosophy out of Hamann. You can see how deeply influential this is to Freud. Even more so, you can see the entire idea of subconsciousness as it was presented by Freud, the entire division to id, ego, and superego being driven by Hamann's ideas. So he is a very, very important influence, and someone who drives a more important development in this particular direction. So he is really at the heart of this idea that what we want to do is we want to invest what is dark, what is strange, what is different, rather to invest ourselves in something that is elevated, pure, celestial, perfect, etc. You could argue that classicism and neoclassicism in this regard were very solar. Romanticism was very Chtonian. So this also goes along with what we were talking about, Romanticism being invested in the grotesque, into all different genres of horror and the like. We could also argue that popular genres of horror were pretty much invented in Romanticism. So our fascination with vampires, with werewolves, with zombies, with mummies, all these different things, they come from Romanticism. Now, of course, all of these already existed in their previous contexts. You could say that the idea of a werewolf is very ancient. The idea of a vampire is also older than Romanticism, but it doesn't matter. It's really in this era that they come together and that they become a staple in horror genre. So you could say that there was another person that was deeply influenced by Hamann, and this is a very important German philosopher, the all-important philosopher, possibly the most important philosopher of them all. Certainly, I know a lot of philosophers who feel this way to this day. We are, of course, talking about Hegel, and we are talking about Hegel's particular take on history and his particular take on the spirit of the stages of development of human history that are very much akin to the stages of development of human art. Hegel was not just an important philosopher, he was also an important aesthetician. He had very important aesthetics. And when we were preparing our very hard, very long exam of aesthetics, we had to read Hegel very thoroughly. We also had to read Kant very thoroughly, but besides the point. So what is the deal with this? Hegel basically sees history as the emanation of the spirit. We have this whole idea of spirit and matter. Of course, this is all very shaped and influenced by the medieval society. And we have this idea of spirit basically slowly appearing and slowly emanating in the world. So when it comes to aesthetics, Hegel argues that we have three main eras, we have three main stages, and they all have to do with how spirit interacts with matter. So Hegel says that in arts we have the primitive period, we then have the classical period, which he deems to be artistically the most perfect, and then we have the romantic period, Romanticism. So in his mind, in primitive art, he takes Egypt, for example, we have matter ruling over spirit, and we have spirit struggling with matter. So they're at odds, and the spirit is unable to conquer the matter. It is not fully developed yet. So this is art that is not at its aesthetic peak. We can see hints at beauty, we can see effort, but it's not quite there yet. Now, when we're talking about the classical period, according to Hegel, this is the most perfect example of all of the arts that we've ever created. And of course, he's talking about the classical period in Greece, 5th century BCE. He sees it as such perfection in terms of art and aesthetics because he claims that spirit and matter are perfectly present and are in perfect harmony. So they are fighting, but this fight is equal. They are in balance, they are in harmony, and they come together in the most beautiful and streaming motion. So it's really the pinnacle of matter and spirit coming together. When he is talking about Romanticism, he is talking about the moment where spirit is overtaking the matter. Spirit is crushing and defeating the matter, which is great if we are thinking about historical development and importance of emanation of spirit, but is not as favorable to arts, because Hegel again defines art as having a lot to do with the sensual world, having a lot to do with matter, and having a lot to do with senses. So he argues that romantic art in this particular regard is inferior aesthetically to classical art, but is a further stage of development when it comes to spirit itself. So you could argue that if you're looking again back at Renaissance of Paleologue art, you can see how separated from the world it is, how deeply spiritual it is. Now, you could argue this about Byzantine art in general, and indeed it's a far more spiritual form of art than anything that ever came from the West. But I would argue that in particular this is present in Renaissance of the Paleologue. This idea that you really separate yourself from this world, that you turn yourself to heaven, you look at eternity. You look at a piece of art as a portal to eternity, as this idea of a higher world, higher truth, higher dimension of existence being materialized, being incorporated and given to you as a spectator. So this is really the last and most developed technically, aesthetically stage of Byzantine art. It's the pinnacle of Byzantine art, if you will. But it's also the pinnacle of this particular approach to art, that it's so deeply and sincerely spiritual. And we can really compare this to Hegel's philosophy. If I remember my Hegel's Aesthetics right, I read it more than once since I had to prepare it for an exam. He didn't really write about icons, I think, at all. I don't remember these examples at all. But I think it's a shame, because this would be a very good example for what he was trying to convey. Now, this whole idea of emanation of spirit can really be retroactively applied on Orthodox Byzantine icons, especially the ones coming from this particular period. Now, I do say that this has to do not only with Orthodox Byzantine icon in its entirety, but especially this period, because this period comes after great devastation, because it comes during the time of great decadence, time when destiny of Eastern Roman Empire is all but forfeit. It is not really comparable, let's say, to the 9th century icons, because those icons can be seen as symbols of a very imperial, very proud, very wealthy empire. So those icons have a lot of, how should we put this, in very crude and blatant terms, a lot of military propaganda to them. So this is the period where we see, let's say, the person of Virgin Mary being developed as the protectress of the armies. And, you know, this is something that doesn't really have a lot to do with the world of spirit, with world of eternal truths and beauties. It has to do with immediate political and military interests in their region. So there is a big difference to be made between Byzantine art before and after the great calamity that was brought to them from the West. What is the thing with this? If we're thinking about the way that spirit emanates and the way that spirit communicates with this material realm, through icons in one way, through churches and basilicas in the other, we are really thinking about what the Byzantine Empire was all about throughout their existence. And this was basically this more and more desperate attempt to stay alive, to keep Roman culture together, to keep the Roman Christian Orthodox, after a certain period, Orthodox, not just Christian, values together. So it's this great tenacity that drove this Roman Empire to last 1,000 years more than the Western Roman Empire. So it's this idea that what they were doing is that they were protecting the Roman Empire. If you think about this, the Roman Empire, I mean the Roman, let's say, poli that grew into a kingdom, that grew into a republic, that grew into an empire, but broadly speaking, Roman civilization started in the 8th or 7th century BCE, and it lasted, well, up until the fall of Constantinople, you could argue. You could also argue that the Ottoman Turks that invaded Constantinople had invaded Constantinople because they wanted to take over the Roman Empire. They did not at all wanted to destroy it, but far from it. They wanted to be Roman themselves. So the minute they took over, they said, yes, we are the Romans now. This is ours. We are the Roman Empire now. Now, if we agree with them, and I see no reason why we shouldn't, you could argue that the Roman Empire then lasted up until the Ottoman Empire fell apart, which was at the beginning of the 20th century. And, you know, this is a very interesting perspective. We never really thought about the Roman Empire lasting all the way to the beginning of the 20th century. We mostly, from this Western European perspective that we had, thought that it fell apart in the 5th century of our current era. So this is just an interesting mental experiment. But the whole idea, to go back to it, what the Byzantine Empire was all about, what the Byzantine culture was all about, is that we're trying to preserve something that is very old. We have this immense pressure of centuries and centuries of building up tradition, of preserving something that is extremely valuable. And as is always the case, and as it will often be the case during this course, we are preserving fragments. So we are truly preserving bits and pieces, remnants. And this is sadly the case, not just because Byzantine Empire had many natural calamities. It had plagues happen a couple of times. One of them, the Justinian plague, was incredibly harmful. It was disastrous. It destroyed, if I'm not mistaken, something about 30% of their entire population. Yeah, this is a tremendous loss for any state to lose 30% of its population. So this is something that can grievously harm any form of state anywhere. They were able to survive this. They had the aforementioned conquest of Western powers at the beginning of the 13th century, the sack of Constantinople. This was hard to survive, but they managed. And more importantly, they had a series of earthquakes that would constantly destroy the geography of where they were. Now, I don't know if you ever went to Turkey. This is roughly where most of the Eastern Roman Empire was situated. This is where the city of Constantinople, that today we know as Istanbul, is situated. This is a period that is very prone to earthquakes. And if you go to Turkey, if you travel around the country a bit, you can visit different places in Turkey. You see a lot of remnants of first Greek holy grounds and temples and oracles and sanctuaries, but also later Roman. They have a lot of these ruins. Now, in most cases, these places are in ruins on account of earthquakes. So not that they were looted, not that they were necessarily destroyed by invading armies or whomever. No, they just simply fell apart because they were built on a very earthquake-prone grounds. So these also are quite disastrous events. Very sadly, there was an earthquake in Turkey just recently, a couple of years ago. It has claimed many lives. So to this day, this is something that that entire region struggles with. So we have this whole idea that physically, on account of the earthquakes, on account of natural calamities, on account of many different armies and wars that this region is involved with, we have our culture in constant state of fragmentation and is under a constant attack, under constant danger of disappearing, and we have to protect it from that. So what we are doing is that we are assembling fragments of our glorious past. And if you come back to the first introductory lecture from this entire course, you can see that it's all about that. This is something that we're going to go back to a lot. So this whole idea that we are assembling bits and pieces, we're assembling puzzles of our glorious past, and we're trying to rekindle it, we're trying to make it all come together again. To go back to the era of Romanticism, we have a very similar, very comparable situation. So we have remnants, bits and pieces of our glorious past that we are trying to bring together. Now, in this particular context, our glorious past, of course, has to do with antiquity, and it has to do with classical Greece. But it's different this time around. What is interesting about European art history, but also history of literature, and any other form of art, really any other form of expression or even civilization, general history, you could also say, is that every new era somehow discovers antiquity. Somehow we discover antiquity in the Renaissance and we're all like, oh my God, antiquity is amazing. Look at these people, look at the things they've done. Then Baroque comes around and they discover the same thing again. It's like, oh my God, look at antiquity. It's amazing. You know, then classicism comes and they're like, oh my God, look at antiquity. And you get the point. So Romanticism is pretty much the same. So they discover antiquity and they're amazed at Greek poetry, they're amazed at Greek sculpture, they're amazed at Greek architecture. This is all, you know, mind-blowing. So they spend their time fawning over these glorious times that had passed. But there is a difference. And the difference is considerable because what people in times of the Renaissance and classicism and neoclassicism were fawning about was this whole idea of Greek art as being incredibly harmonious and being incredibly beautiful and poised and elegant. They imagined this entire era to be as such. They thought the Greeks were these elegant, gentlemanly, well-behaved people who spent half days discussing philosophy and the other half of their day working out, which is amazing. But in Romanticism, we start to discover that this is not necessarily the case, that this was a very bloody period, that they had a lot of wars, they had a lot of intrigues, a lot of backstabbing. So they too had their own plagues. They had these incredibly dark parts, dark aspects of Greek myth. If you venture a bit into Greek myth, as I have, you start seeing some truly disturbing stories there. You see a lot of rape, a lot of incest, a lot of fratricide, a lot of patricide, a lot of all sorts of heinous crimes that are really hard to stomach. And we see this over and over again. We see that Greek gods are, for lack of a better term, assholes. They're really terrible people in terms of character. So they're incredibly far removed from this idea of Christian God that we have, or any Abrahamic God really, that God is a loving, overall just good entity. You could not say that any Greek god is really good. They're vain, they're terribly impulsive, they're angry, they're spiteful, vengeful, they're, again, terrible people, terrible gods, if you will. So we see that there is this interest in Greek culture that is, I would say, far more accurate and closer to the actual Greek culture than the interest than people in the era of Renaissance or Classicism or Neoclassicism had. So they want to understand what is so dark and dirty and bloody in Greek myth. If you read Nietzsche, for example, he is all about this. Nietzsche, by the way, by education is a classical philologist. So he's someone who studied classical literature extensively. This is what he studied the most in his life. And he gets to understand that this is a period that is not at all about harmony or poise or elegance, quite the opposite to that. This is a period that is all about blood and war and conquest and, again, everything that we already mentioned. So you could say that this goes along really well with this whole interest that era of Romanticism carries for whatever is grotesque, twisted, dark, etc. So this goes for their interest with occult, with hidden, with all of things that are not pretty on the surface. So this is something, again, that has to do with the Renaissance of the Paleologs and the very last decadent stage of the Eastern Roman Empire. So what is really important to state here, and what is really important to explore, and we may not have enough time to do this, is the geopolitical situation of Germany in this particular period. We are talking again about late 18th, early 19th century. And again, analogous to that, the geopolitical situation of the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine, in the 13th, 14th, and then partially 15th century. So it is the fact that we were talking about the Crusades as this initially colonial attempt from Western powers to expand their reach, to acquire more wealth, to conquer more land. And this is the case with the Byzantine Empire being a victim of that. So we could say that the initial attempt from the Crusades was to liberate the Holy Lands, but then they sacked Constantinople as a side quest, you might argue, of this main initiative. Now, if we were to talk about Germany or Holy Roman Empire, or call it whatever you will, in this particular Prussia, this was also one of the names of Eastern Germany, they have a very peculiar situation as compared to their Western neighbors, because in this particular period that we're talking about, not just in times of Louis XIV, but even after him, Germany is not a terribly well-developed colonial power. Very, very different to the situation of France, and very different to the situation of Spain, Portugal, England, Holland, and Belgium. So these are colonial powers. They have tremendous territories overseas, especially France, you could argue the main German enemy at the time. They have large interests in the Caribbean, in North America, and Africa, all over Asia. So they truly own large chunks of the world, which means that they have access to a lot of resources. And you could say the same thing about Spain, Portugal, etc. Now, Germany, whichever it is called at a given time, does not. They don't have access to all of these colonies. They don't have access to free labor that happens in colonies, and they don't have access to cheap, or if you will, free resources. And they're terribly frustrated over this. This is basically the reason why we go to World War I, because Germany is frustrated with not having access to colonies, or not having as much access to colonies as the Western European powers do. So you could say that this is another reason why we have Romanticism shape itself as it does. Romanticism is very, very focalized into everything that is local. So you could argue that Enlightenment was all about the global initiative because it came from a colonial culture. It came from a culture that sought to impose itself upon the entire world. But Germany didn't have this capacity. They didn't have the capacity to project themselves. They didn't have colonies. They were not as colonial as France was. So their entire worldview was considerably reduced, or forcefully reduced, if you will. And they had to develop fascination or focus, or call it what you will, on local rather than the global. You could say the same thing about the decadent last stages of the Byzantine Empire. They did not have the power to project themselves. They lost their former glory of the empire, so they were shrinking, they were smaller and smaller, and they were forced to handle with their local agenda rather than with the global one. So you could say what becomes very important in Romanticism, especially in German Romanticism, but all the other ones later, is this fascination with the local, with soil, something that is your immediate environment, something that the Nazis would later instrumentalize in their blood and soil ideology. And this whole idea that you do not care about the world as such, you care about your particular corner of the world. So you could say that ideology of nationalism has a lot to do with Romanticism. It really is profoundly shaped by this era and all of the tendencies that we were discussing that were present in this era. And we could say that you can argue the same thing is the case with the last decadent stages of the Eastern Roman Empire. So we could also say that their refusal of everything that has to do with West is really a part of this entire affair. Because, again, in their mind, West is something that destroys them, be it the Western crusading powers or be it Louis XIV. The West is something that is colonial, and they are not. Be it, again, the Byzantine Empire that is no longer capable of being colonial, or be it the Germany that is frustrated over not being colonial. Now, not that the Germans were more moral than the Western Europeans, not that they would mind having colonies, they were just not able to. So this is the main difference. Now, we would need to conclude because we are getting over an hour that we've dedicated to this. And we should just need to say that the very important part of Romanticism is Orientalism, and this is something you can see that if you go to the Louvre Museum, if you go to the Orsay Museum, even to a certain extent to the Pompidou Museum, I'm just giving you the most important references when it comes to museums. This is present all over 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st century art. Orientalism, as it was defined by Edward Said, this idea that you are fascinated by whatever is more primitive than yourself. So you could argue that Orientalism is a very, very important aspect of Romanticism. And I mean, a lot can be said about this. I just wanted to say that the main focus of romantic interest in whatever is Oriental is not at all by accident, Greece, or whichever part of the world was Byzantine Empire back in the day. So let's say that when a famous romantic poet, Lord Byron, writes his famous and incredibly boring epic poem Childe Harold, that I said was incredibly boring, and I stand by it, and I will defend it if I have to. This is a terrible work of literature. He basically situates it in whatever he sees as the Orient, or whatever he sees as the Middle East. So this is roughly the region of Greece, Albania, the Balkans, if you will. The region where I happen to come from also. So he sees Balkans as this wild country where you have primitive tribes, but in this very romantic idea, primitivism is something that is good. Now, these are obviously people that are frustrated by their own civilization, by the ongoing industrial revolution. So they fetishize whatever they see as a wild, unruly, authentic, uncivilized way of life. So he admires the tribes of Albania, who to him are perfectly and entirely uncivilized, which is of course not at all true, but he sees it as such. And he sees this entire region that used to be the pinnacle of human effort, of human civilization, as incredibly backwards. And this is why he's so fascinated by it. Byron, however, was so fascinated by Greece that he left to help, he left England and all the glory and all the scandals and all the fame he had, all the wealth he had, to help the Greek revolutionaries fight against the Ottomans. So this is where he died. He died in Greece. And he was eternally fascinated by it. But he was fascinated from a very orientalizing point of view. So there is even this connection, there is even this connection between Romanticism and the Byzantine culture, the late decadent Byzantine culture, that to them is something that is oriental, something that is Eastern, exotic, mysterious, strange, etc. You have this present in art, of course, visual arts. You know, Orientalism is again a very present theme, and the entire genre of painting. There's a lot of Oriental architecture. We have the very famous example of Sacred Heart of Montmartre in Paris being Neo-Byzantine and Neo-Romanesque in style. although it was made in the turn of the century from 19th to 20th. So yeah, you could say that this is how many people in the West see the Byzantine culture. And I find this to be not only entirely wrong, but downright hilarious, because coming from a formerly Byzantine country myself, I can see it in a very, very different manner. And I hope I will be able to explain it as such. So yeah, to conclude, we have this whole idea of East and West being an eternal opposition, dichotomical opposition, West representing matter, East representing the spirit. We'll get back to this dichotomy many times over. And we can see how, again, Romanticism on one end and the Renaissance of the Paleologs on the other share very similar traits. It's a historical analogy, although there are many centuries separating them. So I thank you for your attention. I'm sorry we went a bit over our given time, and I hope to keep it shorter next time. So see you in our next installment. That one's going to be dedicated to my favorite topic of Gothic and Impressionism. I'm very much looking forward to it. Have a nice day. Ciao.